The Abandoned House Ghost. Spine-chilling horror unfolds. This chilling tale follows the journey of Michael and Sarah, a newlywed couple who find themselves haunted by a series of terrifying events after their wedding day in a remote mansion. As Michael's mother, Mrs. Dawson, uncovers disturbing signs, red wine turning blood-colored, Sarah's strange behavior, and ominous phone calls, tension and fear escalate rapidly. The couple's honeymoon takes a tragic turn when they mysteriously vanish, only to be found in a state of confusion, unaware of the horrors they faced. What unfolds is a multi-layered story of betrayal, murder, and unresolved grudges from the past. The spirit of a scorned woman, betrayed 25 years earlier, wreaks havoc on those she believes wronged her. As secrets of love, revenge, and guilt unravel, the characters are drawn into a deadly web, where a past sin demands vengeance. In a final act of terror, the couple's fate intertwines with that of a tragic ghost, leaving behind unanswered questions and an atmosphere of dread. Part 1. The Wedding's Dark Omen. The day had begun like a dream, sunlight streaming through the ancient windows of the grand hall, casting a golden glow across the faces of loved ones who had gathered to celebrate the union of Michael and Sarah. The bride, in her flowing ivory gown, looked radiant as she stood beside Michael, his arm around her waist, both smiling in blissful ignorance of the dark shadow lurking just beyond the edges of their happiness. But as the day wore on and the evening approached, the atmosphere shifted like a soft but eerie breeze creeping through the cracks of a forgotten door. It started with little things no one else seemed to notice. Sarah had been so full of life just hours earlier, her laughter bright and infectious. Now she seemed distant, pale and unsettled, as if some unseen weight had been placed upon her shoulders. Her hand trembled slightly as she gripped Michael's arm during the toast. Still, no one commented on it. After all, it was a wedding. Nerves and excitement were bound to play tricks on the mind. Guests were too wrapped up in their own joy and celebration to notice the shift, too busy raising glasses and exchanging well wishes. But Michael noticed. He felt it in the way Sarah's fingers dug into his sleeve, not in affection, but in a quiet desperation. "Michael," Sarah whispered, her voice strained and barely audible over the music. "Look at the wine." At first, Michael dismissed it as nerves. He glanced down at the glass in his hand, expecting to see the same pale rose champagne they had been drinking all evening. But as he lifted the glass, his blood ran cold. The liquid inside had darkened from its cheerful pink hue, transforming into something altogether more sinister, a deep, murky crimson, thick and unsettling, like congealed blood. His breath caught in his throat as he stared into the glass. Could it be a trick of the light? He swirled the wine gently, hoping it was merely a reflection, but the color remained dark, swirling like something alive within the glass. A chill passed through him, as though a cold hand had gripped the back of his neck. "Sarah, it's just, maybe it's nothing," Michael said, though he didn't believe his own words. He could see the fear in Sarah's eyes, the way her gaze remained fixed on the glasses of wine placed before their guests, each one now tainted with that same unnerving crimson color. The murmur of voices around them faded into the background as the room seemed to grow colder. Time stretched painfully as Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced around the room, looking for some sign that the others had noticed, but to his shock, no one seemed aware of the change. They were all too lost in their revelry, oblivious to the creeping dread that had begun to crawl up Michael's spine. Sarah, however, couldn't tear her eyes away from the wine. She looked ill, her face growing paler with each passing moment. Her lips trembled as she leaned closer to Michael. "I don't feel well. Something's wrong." Michael's grip tightened on her arm as he gently guided her toward the door, away from the crowd. "Let's get some air," he murmured, trying to keep his voice steady. He could feel Sarah's weight leaning heavily into him, her steps growing more unsteady with each passing second. Just as they reached the grand entrance of the hall, a loud crash echoed through the room. Michael turned just in time to see a wine glass shatter on the floor, the dark red liquid splattering across the pristine white tablecloth like fresh blood. A collective gasp rippled through the guests, but before anyone could react, a low, guttural moan echoed from the back of the room, causing the hairs on Michael's neck to stand on end. The sound came from Sarah. She collapsed in his arms, her body limp and cold. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Michael thought she was gone. He shook her gently, his voice a desperate whisper. "Sarah, Sarah, wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, but they were glazed and distant, as though she were looking at something far beyond the physical world. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, only a faint exhalation that sent a wave of dread crashing over Michael. "We need to go," he whispered to himself, fear tightening his chest as he scooped Sarah into his arms. The eyes of the guests followed them as they left the hall, but none dared to approach. The mood had shifted. The once joyous celebration had turned cold, as though some invisible force had drained the warmth from the room. Even the music, which had been cheerful just moments before, now seemed discordant, eerie, as if it were being played by unseen hands. As Michael carried Sarah outside into the crisp evening air, a strange silence fell over them. The sounds of the wedding laughter, music, chatter faded into the distance, replaced by the ominous whisper of the wind through the trees. Sarah stirred slightly in his arms, her eyelids fluttering, but she remained weak and dazed. Michael's heart raced as he reached their car, carefully placing Sarah in the passenger seat. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his breathing. Something was terribly wrong, and he had no idea what it was. Just as he slid into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen illuminated with an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering, dread filling him as he lifted the phone to his ear. "Hello," his voice was barely above a whisper. A long, heavy silence greeted him, followed by a low, almost inhuman voice that sent shivers down his spine. "Congratulations on your marriage," Michael, the voice rasped. "But she's not the bride you think she is." Michael's blood ran cold. He glanced at Sarah, who was still unconscious beside him, her pale face bathed in the eerie glow of the moonlight. His hands trembled as the voice continued, slow and deliberate, each word sinking like a stone in his chest. "Leave the mansion now." Before it's too late, before Michael could respond, the line went dead, leaving behind only the hum of static and the pounding of his own heart. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he stared at the phone, his mind racing with fear and confusion. What had they just walked into? 10:30. Michael didn't need any more convincing. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he started the car, his eyes darting nervously to Sarah, hoping she would wake up, but her breathing remained shallow, her skin cold to the touch. As he drove away from the mansion, a strange sense of dread clung to him, like a dark cloud that refused to lift. The further they got from the wedding, the more Michael's thoughts spiraled into panic. What had that voice meant? Who had called him? And why did Sarah collapse the moment the wine changed? He could still see it in his mind, the dark, blood-bled liquid swirling in the glass, like a warning of something much worse to come. The drive was silent, save for the occasional gasp from Sarah as she shifted in her seat, still locked in her strange, feverish state. Michael's thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of what had happened, but there were no answers, only fear. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as the road wound on beneath their tires, leading them further and further from the nightmare they had left behind. But even as the mansion faded into the distance, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, lingering just at the edge of his vision, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Part 2. A chilling phone call. The moon hung high above the darkened mansion, its pale glow casting long, jagged shadows across the empty grounds. The wedding was over, and the guests had slowly begun to leave, their excitement dampened by the strange events that had unfolded. Michael and Sarah's sudden departure, coupled with the unsettling moment when the wine had turned a sinister shade of red, had left an unspoken tension in the air. Mrs. Dawson stood by the grand window in her room, staring out at the quiet night, her thoughts heavy with unease. Something wasn't right. She couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the evening had been more than mere coincidence. There had been a darkness, a cold presence lurking just beneath the surface, waiting, watching. She paced the room, her hand gripping the delicate chain of her necklace, twisting it nervously between her fingers. The silence of the house felt oppressive, suffocating even, as if the very walls were closing in around her. A shiver ran down her spine as she thought of Sarah, how pale and fragile she had looked as Michael carried her from the hall. The girl had seemed so full of life earlier, but something had changed, Mrs. Dawson had seen it in her eyes, a flicker of something. Dark, something that didn't belong. She stopped pacing, her mind racing. She needed answers, but she had no idea where to begin. With a sigh, she moved to the edge of her bed and sank down, the mattress creaking softly beneath her weight. The room was cold, colder than it should have been, and despite the thick robe she wore, she couldn't seem to shake the chill that had settled into her bones. As she sat in the quiet, the events of the evening replayed in her mind like a broken record: the wine, the shattering glass, Sarah's collapse. Her instincts told her that something was wrong, that there was more to this than anyone realized. But what? What had happened to Sarah? The shrill ring of her phone cut through the silence like a knife, causing Mrs. Dawson to jump. She grabbed the device from the nightstand, her heart racing, and glanced at the screen. An unknown number. Her fingers hovered over the answer button for a moment before she pressed it, bringing the phone to her ear. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a long, eerie silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Mrs. Dawson thought the call had disconnected. But then, a sound of faint, rasping breath, like someone struggling to speak from the depths of some cold, dark place. Her grip tightened on the phone, her knuckles white. "Who is this?" More silence, followed by a low, almost inhuman chuckle. The sound was deep, guttural, and filled with a malice that made Mrs. Dawson's skin crawl. Her pulse quickened, her heart thundering in her chest as she stood, backing away from the window. "You should be more careful," the voice said, its tone thick with venom. "She's not who you think she is." Mrs. Dawson's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about? Who's not who?" A cold, mocking laugh echoed through the line, as though the speaker found her confusion amusing. "You let her into your family, but she doesn't belong." She never did, fear shot through Mrs. Dawson like ice water in her veins. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the cryptic message, but the voice on the other end seemed to relish in her confusion. "She's not your son's wife." "Not really," the voice continued, each word dripping with menace. "You should have seen it, but you were too blind." "What are you talking about?" Mrs. Dawson demanded, her voice rising in desperation. "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice paused, and for a brief, terrible moment, Mrs. Dawson thought she could hear the faint sound of crying, a woman's sobs far away, as though they were coming from the other side of some invisible veil. Then the voice spoke again, softer this time, more dangerous. "She'll take him from you, slowly, until there's nothing left of him, just like the others." "The others?" Mrs. Dawson's heart hammered in her chest as her knees buckled, forcing her to sit down again. "What do you mean?" "The others? What have you done to Sarah?" There was no reply, only the distant sound of that eerie sobbing growing louder, as though whatever was on the other end of the line was drawing closer. Mrs. Dawson could feel the cold air in the room grow heavier, almost as if the very walls were pressing down on her. Then, as quickly as it had started, the sobbing stopped, replaced by that same mocking chuckle. "It's already too late, Mrs. Dawson. You'll see soon enough with that." The line went dead. For a moment, Mrs. Dawson simply sat there, the phone still pressed against her ear, as if expecting the voice to return, to offer some kind of explanation. But all that greeted her was the low hum of static. Slowly, she lowered the phone to her lap, her hands trembling uncontrollably. What had she just heard? Was it a prank? A sick joke? But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The voice had been too real, too filled with malice and knowledge. And the things it had said about Sarah, about the others that gnawed at her, sending a fresh wave of fear coursing through her veins. Mrs. Dawson stood again, her legs shaking beneath her. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here, waiting for whatever horror was unfolding to engulf her son, her family. But what could she do? Where could she turn? The house felt impossibly large and empty around her, every creak and groan amplified in the silence. Even the moonlight streaming through the window seemed more sinister now, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced across the walls. She picked up her phone again, intending to call Michael to warn him, but stopped herself. What could she say? How could she say? How could she have just experienced without sounding insane? "I got a strange phone call, and now I think your wife isn't who she says she is." It sounded ridiculous, even to her. And what if Michael didn't believe her? What if this only drove him further away? The uncertainty gnawed at her. But the fear for her son, fear for the unknown horror lurking just beyond her understanding was stronger. With a shaky breath, Mrs. Dawson turned away from the window, her footsteps echoing as she paced the length of the room. She had to think, had to figure out what to do. But as the minutes ticked by, the weight of the phone call hung over her like a storm cloud, oppressive and threatening. She was about to sit back down when her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call but a text. The number was still unknown. Her stomach flipped as she opened the message, dreading what she would find. "Look closer," the message read. Look closer? At what? Before she could even begin to make sense of it, another text came through, this one accompanied by an image. Mrs. Dawson's breath caught in her throat as she opened it. It was a photo of Sarah, standing in her wedding dress, smiling. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The Sarah in the photo wasn't the radiant, glowing bride Mrs. Dawson had seen earlier that day. Her eyes were too wide, too dark, and her smile, though perfectly shaped, felt unnatural, as if it had been twisted into something grotesque. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and around her neck. Mrs. Dawson squinted, her pulse quickening. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but there was something around Sarah's neck faint, like the shadow of a bruise or a mark. As Mrs. Dawson stared at the photo, her heart pounding, another text came through. "She's not your Sarah." The phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor, as the full weight of the words crashed down on her. Not your Sarah. What did that mean? Who was this person she had welcomed into her family, into her son's life? And why was the voice on the phone so certain that Sarah wasn't who she claimed to be? A heavy dread settled over Mrs. Dawson, suffocating her as she stood frozen in the center of the room. The photo still burned into her mind. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, she heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward her door. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened, heart pounding in her chest, the air around her growing colder by the second. She turned toward the door, every muscle in her body tense, her mind racing. The footsteps stopped just outside her room. For a moment there was only silence, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on her like a weight. Then, a soft knock echoed through the room, sending a shiver down her spine. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes locked on the door, her breath shallow and panicked. Another knock, louder this time. Mrs. Dawson stepped back, her pulse racing. She could feel it now, the darkness closing in around her, suffocating her, swallowing the light. And then, a voice soft, familiar, and laced with malice. "Mrs. Dawson, it's me, Sarah." Part 3. The Disappearance. The night after Michael and Sarah's wedding felt like a lingering nightmare. Mrs. Dawson couldn't shake the unease that had wrapped itself around her since a strange phone call. The voice that had whispered chilling warnings about Sarah echoed in her mind like a curse. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and every fiber of her being knew it. Early the next morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the heavy curtains, Mrs. Dawson's phone buzzed. She reached for it with trembling hands, her heart already racing, expecting another eerie message. But it was a call from the hotel where Michael and Sarah were supposed to be staying. Mrs. Dawson, the receptionist's voice was polite, but there was an edge of confusion to it. "I'm sorry to bother you so early, but we haven't been able to contact Mr. Michael or Mrs. Sarah since last night. Their room, well, no one has been inside since the wedding. We've checked multiple times." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Dawson's throat went dry. "They never returned to the hotel." The receptionist hesitated before replying. "No, ma'am. The room is untouched. Their belongings are there, but there's no sign of them." The world seemed to tilt beneath Mrs. Dawson's feet. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Michael and Sarah had vanished. The mansion was buzzing with tension as the family gathered later that morning. Everyone had the same questions but no answers. Where were Michael and Sarah? Why hadn't they contacted anyone? Why was their hotel room exactly as they had left it, empty, sterile, devoid of any trace that they had spent the night there? "I'm sure they'll find," one of the relatives offered weakly, but their words hung in the air like a hollow promise, unconvincing. Mrs. Dawson remained silent, her mind spiraling back to the cryptic phone call from the previous night. "She's not who you think she is," the voice had hissed. Was this connected to their sudden disappearance? Her chest tightened with fear as she considered the possibility. Hours passed with no word from Michael or Sarah, and the family's anxiety only grew. Mrs. Dawson paced the room, unable to sit still. She knew something was terribly wrong. The hotel room untouched, the warnings, and now this dreadful silence. It felt like they were all trapped in some twisted nightmare, a game where the rules were hidden, and danger lurked just out of sight. Suddenly her phone buzzed again. She froze, her stomach twisting as she glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Her fingers hovered over the answer button, dread pooling in her gut. Slowly she pressed the button and brought the phone to her ear. "Hello," her voice trembled slightly. There was a pause, and then that same cold, mocking voice from the night before filled her ear. Looking for Michael and Sarah, Mrs. Dawson's blood ran cold. "Where are they?" she demanded, her voice sharp with fear. The voice chuckled softly, sending a shiver down her spine. "They are safe. For now, what do you want?" she asked, her throat tight. "Who are you?" "You already know the answer, Mrs. Dawson. You just don't want to believe it." Her heart pounded in her chest, her fingers trembling as she gripped the phone tighter. "What have you done to my son?" she hissed, her fear quickly morphing into anger. "Oh, I haven't done anything. Yet." The voice was dripping with amusement, as if this was all some sick game. "But Sarah, well, let's just say she's not as innocent as she seems." Mrs. Dawson's breath hitched, her mind racing. The voice on the phone was toying with her, feeding her just enough information to stoke the flames of terror, but never enough to give her control. "You want answers, Mrs. Dawson? Then you need to go back to the mansion. That's where it all began, isn't it?" The mention of the mansion sent a jolt of cold fear through her veins. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You see," the voice replied smoothly. "Return to the mansion tonight. Everything will be revealed." Before she could ask anything else, the line went dead, leaving her in the suffocating silence of the room. As the day wore on, the weight of the mysterious phone call gnawed at Mrs. Dawson's mind. She couldn't tell anyone else about the voice, about the warnings, without sounding paranoid or worse, unhinged. But the more she thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together. The disappearance, the untouched hotel room, the strange warning about Sarah. It all pointed back to the mansion, the place where the ominous events of the wedding had unfolded. By evening, Mrs. Dawson had made up her mind she would go back to the mansion, alone. She had to know what was lurking in the shadows of that place, what secrets it was hiding, and most of all, she needed to find Michael and Sarah. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the property, Mrs. Dawson pulled up to the mansion. The air around it seemed unnaturally still, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. The once grand structure loomed before her, its windows dark and lifeless, the ornate carvings on its facade taking on an eerie, almost malevolent quality in the fading light. Steeling herself, Mrs. Dawson stepped out of her car and made her way toward the front door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the house, the silence pressing in on her like a physical weight. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the door handle. This was it, the point of no return. Whatever answers awaited her inside, she wasn't sure she wanted to know them. But she had no choice. Michael and Sarah's lives could depend on it. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the interior of the mansion was bathed in shadows. The grand staircase rose up before her, its banister gleaming faintly in the dim light. Mrs. Dawson's footsteps echoed eerie in the vast, empty space as she moved deeper into the house, her heart racing with every step. She hadn't been inside the mansion since the wedding, and now, in the darkness, the place seemed almost alive, its walls whispering secrets, its floors creaking under the weight of unseen presences. Every corner seemed to hold some dark, hidden thread and misses. Dawson couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She moved through the halls, her breath coming in short, panic bursts as she strained to listen for any sound, any sign of Michael or Sarah. But the house remained deathly silent. As she reached the main dining room, Mrs. Dawson paused. The room was just as it had been on the night of the wedding lawn, elegant tables adorned with candles and flowers, the remnants of the celebration still scattered across the surfaces. But there was something different now. A chill in the air, a sense of foreboding that seemed to hang over the space like a dark cloud. Her eyes were drawn to the far end of the room, where a large mirror hung on the wall. Something about the mirror made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Slowly, she approached it, her reflection growing larger as she drew closer. And then, as she stood before the mirror, she saw it, a faint figure standing behind her in the reflection. Mrs. Dawson's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering in her chest as she spun around. But there was no one there. The room was empty. She turned back to the mirror, her hands shaking as she stared into the glass. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread remained, growing stronger with every passing second. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled for it, her hands trembling as she answered the call. "I see you've made it back," the familiar voice purred, sending a shiver down her spine. Mrs. Dawson swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Where are Michael and Sarah?" she demanded. The voice chuckled softly. "All in good time. But first you need to understand something. The mansion is not just a house. It's a gateway, a place where the past and present collided." Mrs. Dawson's pulse quickened as the voice continued. "Everything that happened here, the wedding, the wine, Sarah's collapse, it was just the beginning. The real story is much older, much darker than you could ever imagine. And if you want to find your son, you'll have to face it. Her heart raced as the words sank in. What do you mean there's a room in this house? Mrs. Dawson, the voice whispered. A room that holds the key to everything. You'll know it when you see it. But be warned, once you enter, there's no going back. The line went dead, and Mrs. Dawson stood frozen in the empty room, her heart pounding in her chest. Part 4. Unexplained Visions. The discovery of Michael and Sarah unconscious in their hotel room shook everyone to the core. They were found lying side by side, as if they'd fallen into a deep, unbroken sleep. The hotel staff had tried to wake them, but no matter how much they shook or shouted, the couple remained eerie still. Their breathing was shallow, their bodies limp, yet their faces were peaceful, almost serene. Mrs. Dawson had rushed to the scene, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment she laid eyes on her son and his new wife, lying there so lifeless, her fear gripped her tighter than ever before. Something unnatural was at play, something she couldn't explain but could feel deep in her bones. The doctors could find nothing wrong with them. Physically, they were fine, no signs of injury, no evidence of foul play. Yet Michael and Sarah remained unresponsive, as if trapped in some hidden nightmare. They were taken to the hospital, where they were placed under observation. The doctors were baffled, but Mrs. Dawson knew this wasn't a medical issue. It was something far darker. Hours passed in a blur of anxiety. Mrs. Dawson sat by Sarah's bedside, her eyes heavy from exhaustion, but too frightened to close. She watched Sarah's face, her skin pale under the sterile hospital lights, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Michael was in the room next door, still unmoving, still lost in whatever dream had ensnared him. Then, without warning, Sarah's eyes snapped open. Her breathing hitched and her entire body jerked violently, as if she had been ripped from the depths of some horrific vision. She gasped for air, her eyes wide with terror, darting around the room like a trapped animal. Sarah, Mrs. Dawson exclaimed, rushing to her side. Sarah, it's okay, you're safe. But Sarah didn't seem to hear her. Her eyes, glazed with fear, fixed on something in the distance, something only she could see. Her lips quivered as she tried to form words, but they came out in disjointed whispers. She's coming. She's here. The woman. She won't stop. Sarah's voice was barely audible, and her words sent a chill down Mrs. Dawson's spine. Who's coming? Mrs. Dawson asked, gripping Sarah's hand, her own trembling with fear. The woman. Sarah's voice cracked. She's in the house. The mansion. Suddenly, Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream, her body thrashing violently against the bed, as if she were trying to escape some unseen force. Nurses rushed into the room, pinning her down to prevent her from injuring herself, but Sarah's strength was unnerving. She struggled with a ferocity Mrs. Dawson had never seen before, her eyes wild with panic. She's coming for me, Sarah shrieked, her voice hoarse with terror. The curse. The curse is real. We're all going to die. Mrs. Dawson felt the blood drain from her face. The curse, the mansion, the ghostly woman. It was all connected. Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of it all, but there was no logic to cling to, no way to rationalize the supernatural horror that was unfolding before her eyes. The nurses sedated Sarah, and slowly her body relaxed, her thrashing reduced to soft whimpers. But even in her drug-induced sleep, Sarah's face was contorted with fear, her lips moving in silent, desperate plays. That night, as Mrs. Dawson sat vigil over Sarah's unconscious form, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of machines and the occasional murmur from the hallway. But there was something else in the air, a presence. It pressed in on her, heavy and oppressive, making her skin crawl. Her thoughts kept returning to Sarah's words. The woman, the curse, what had she seen in her visions? Was it merely a nightmare, or had something followed them from the mansion, something that had latched onto Sarah, tormenting her? Suddenly the room's temperature dropped. Mrs. Dawson shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The air felt different now, colder, thicker. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, creeping along the walls like living things. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. She turned her head slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Standing at the foot of Sarah's bed was a figure, a woman, pale and gaunt, her hair long and disheveled, her eyes hollow and dark. She wore a tattered white gown, the fabric stained with dirt and something darker, something that looked like blood. Mrs. Dawson froze, unable to move or even scream. The woman's eyes locked onto Sarah, her expression twisted with anger, and sorrow. Slowly she raised a skeletal hand, pointing a finger at the sleeping bride. "The curse is upon you." The woman's voice was a whisper, but it echoed through the room, filling Mrs. Dawson's ears with dread. Mrs. Dawson wanted to shout, to chase the figure away, but she was paralyzed with fear. The woman moved closer, her feet not quite touching the ground, her body swaying like a spectre caught in an eternal breeze. She reached for Sarah, her hand hovering above her, as if to claim her for the grave. "No, Mrs. Dawson," finally found her voice, weak and trembling. "Stay away from her." But the ghostly woman didn't respond. She leaned down, her face inches from Sarah's, and whispered something that Mrs. Dawson couldn't hear. Then, in the blink of an eye, she vanished, leaving behind only the cold, suffocating weight of her presence. Mrs. Dawson sat there for what felt like hours, her body trembling with fear, her heart racing. She didn't know what to do, who to turn to. The vision of the ghostly woman haunted her. Her cold, accusing eyes burned into her memory. She knew now, without a doubt, that they were dealing with something far beyond the natural world. The next morning, Sarah woke up again, but this time she was calmer, though her face was drawn, pale and tired. Her eyes met Mrs. Dawson's, and there was something in them, an understanding, a resignation. "I saw her again," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "Who?" Mrs. Dawson asked, though she already knew the answer. "The woman. She came to me in my sleep. She told me about the curse. She said it's tied to the mansion, to the land it was built on. She said that every bride who marries there, they all suffer the same fate. They all die." Mrs. Dawson's blood ran cold. "That's not true," she said, trying to convince herself as much as Sarah. "It's just a dream, Sarah. None of this is real." But Sarah shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "It's real, Mrs. Dawson. I can feel it. She's coming for me, just like she came for the others. I can't escape it. We can't escape it." Tears well up in Mrs. Dawson's eyes as she reached for Sarah's hand. "We're going to figure this out, Sarah, I promise you. We're going to find a way to stop this." But deep down, Mrs. Dawson wasn't sure if they could. The curse seemed to have already taken hold, its roots sinking deep into Sarah's mind, and perhaps into her very soul. And the ghostly woman, whatever or whoever she was, wasn't finished with them yet. As the days passed, Sarah's condition worsened. The visions grew more frequent, more vivid, and more terrifying. Every time she closed her eyes, the woman was there, standing at the foot of her bed, watching, waiting. The curse was no longer just a distant threat, it was a living, breathing entity, tightening its grip around Sarah with each passing hour. One night, as Sarah lay in bed, her breathing shallow, her eyes flickering with fear, Mrs. Dawson made a decision. They had to go back. They had to return to the mansion where it all began. The answers, the key to breaking the curse, it was all there. The mansion held the secrets, and if they didn't uncover them soon, Sarah wouldn't survive. "We're going back," Mrs. Dawson said firmly, holding Sarah's hand. "We're going to end this." Sarah's eyes filled with fear, but she nodded. There was no other choice. The mansion awaited them. Part 5. The tragic tale of Victoria Langley. Mrs. Dawson's hands trembled as she leafed through the old newspaper clippings, her eyes scanning the faded ink of long-forgotten headlines. The deeper she dug into the history surrounding the mansion, the darker the secrets became. Each article seemed to unveil another layer of mystery, a chilling revelation that sent icy shivers down her spine. But it was one name that continued to surface over and over again: Victoria Langley. Victoria's story wasn't just tragic, it was the very heart of the nightmare that had taken hold of her family. The curse, the ghostly woman haunting Sarah, the mysterious visions, they all traced back to this woman whose life had been marked by betrayal and heartbreak. And as Mrs. Dawson pieced together Victoria's tale, a horrifying realization began to dawn on her. Michael's father was responsible for everything. It all started 25 years ago. Victoria Langley had been a young woman full of life and hope, deeply in love with a man she believed would be her forever. That man was Charles Dawson, Michael's father. At the time, Charles had been a dashing, charismatic figure, and Victoria had fallen hopelessly for him. Their romance blossomed in the very mansion where Michael and Sarah had recently held their wedding, a place that was once filled with laughter and love, now a decaying relic steeped in sorrow. But Charles had harbored dark secrets. He was already promised to another woman, Michael's mother. Despite his passionate affair with Victoria, his true intentions were never to stay with her. To Charles, Victoria had been a fleeting indulgence, a passing fancy, nothing more. Yet, for Victoria, their love had been everything. She had given herself completely, trusting him with not only her heart but also her future. The betrayal came swiftly and brutally. Victoria had discovered that Charles was to be married not to her, but to a woman of his own social standing. In a cruel twist of fate, she was left heartbroken and alone, discarded like a worn-out trinket. But the deepest wound of all came when she learned she was pregnant. Pregnant and abandoned, Victoria's once bright future turned into a waking nightmare. The scandal of an unwed mother in those times was unbearable, and she was shunned by the very society she had once been a part of. Victoria had no choice but to retreat to the very mansion where she had fallen in love with Charles, now an empty, hollow reminder of what she had lost. It was there, in the darkened halls of that forsaken house, that Victoria's sorrow turned to bitterness, and her bitterness to something far more dangerous. Isolated from the world, she spiraled into despair, her heart growing colder and more resentful with each passing day. She wandered those rooms alone, waiting for Charles to return, waiting for him to realize the mistake he had made. But Charles never came. Instead, he went on to live his life, marrying Michael's mother, building a family, and leaving Victoria and her unborn child behind in the shadows of the past. But Victoria's torment did not end with abandonment. She had believed hope that she could raise her child alone, that the child would be her light in the darkness. But fate had other plans. On the night she went into labor, complications arose, and there was no one to help her. The birth was difficult, violent, and ultimately fatal. Victoria died, her child stillborn. They say her last words were a curse upon Charles, upon his family, upon anyone who would dare find happiness in the place where she had lost everything. Mrs. Dawson's throat tightened as she read the final passage of the article detailing Victoria's death. The words felt heavy, like they were suffocating her. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but the picture they formed was far more horrific than she could have ever imagined. Victoria had not just been a ghost haunting the mansion. She was the curse itself, a spirit so consumed by grief and rage that she had become a living nightmare, determined to destroy any trace of happiness tied to the Dawson family. And now, her vengeance had turned toward Michael and Sarah. Desperate for answers, Mrs. Dawson sought out anyone who had known Victoria, hoping to uncover more about her past. It wasn't easy. Most of the people who had known Victoria were long gone or unwilling to speak of her. But one old woman, a former housekeeper at the mansion, finally agreed to talk. Mrs. Dawson met the woman in a small, dim-lit parlor, the air thick with the scent of old books and lavender. The woman, now frail and hunched with age, spoke in a low, raspy voice, her eyes clouded with memories long buried. Victoria was the sweetest girl. Before it all happened, the woman began, her voice heavy with sorrow. She was full of life, always laughing, always smiling. But then, Charles Dawson came into her life and everything changed. Mrs. Dawson listened intently as the woman recounted Victoria's descent into madness, her heartbreak growing into something darker, more sinister. "I remember the night she died," the woman said, her voice trembling. It was a stormy night, the kind where the wind howls and the rain beats against the windows like a warning. Victoria had been screaming for hours in labor. We tried to help her, but there was nothing we could do. She was too far gone. And when the baby died, well, that was it for her. She cursed the house, cursed Charles, cursed everyone. Her last words were a promise of revenge. The woman leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing, as if she could still see Victoria's ghost wandering the halls of the mansion. "They say her spirit never left that house. It's her curse that haunts it now. Every bride who marries there, every woman who finds love in that place, she takes them, just like she was taken. The mansion won't let them leave." Mrs. Dawson's heart pounded in her chest. Sarah had been right all along. The visions, the ghostly figure, it was Victoria, and she had set her sights on Sarah as her next victim. Armed with this knowledge, Mrs. Dawson rushed back to the hospital, determined to protect her son and daughter-in-law. But as she entered Sarah's room, a chilling sight greeted her. Sarah lay pale and still, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling in silent terror. "She's here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Victoria, she won't let me go, she says. She says I'm next." Tears filled Mrs. Dawson's eyes as she knelt by Sarah's bedside, clutching her hand. "We'll stop her," she promised. "We'll break the curse. I won't let her take you," but deep down, Mrs. Dawson knew it wouldn't be easy. Victoria's curse was ancient, powerful, and fueled by a rage that had festered for decades, and as long as Victoria's spirit remained bound to the mansion, there would be no escape. In the days that followed, Sarah's condition deteriorated. The visions grew more frequent, more violent. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, clutching her chest as if an invisible force was choking the life out of her. And each time she would describe the same thing, the cold, bony hand of a woman dragging her down into darkness. Mrs. Dawson knew time was running out. If they didn't act soon, Victoria would claim Sarah just as she had claimed so many others before her. There was only one way to end this. Mrs. Dawson knew what she had to do. They had to return to the mansion. Victoria's body had never been properly laid to rest. She had died in anger, her soul bound to the very place where her life had unraveled. If they could find her remains, if they could give her the peace she had been denied for so long, maybe, just maybe, the curse could be lifted. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. As Mrs. Dawson prepared for the journey back to the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Victoria had waited for this moment, had orchestrated everything to bring them back. But Mrs. Dawson had no choice. She had to save Sarah, no matter the cost. With a heavy heart and a growing sense of dread, Mrs. Dawson made the final arrangements. The mansion awaited them, and with it, the ghost of Victoria Langley. And Victoria was ready. Part 6. The haunting intensifies. The mansion loomed like a dark sentinel on the hill, its broken windows reflecting the stormy skies as if the house itself were alive, watching and waiting. The air around it was thick with the weight of unspeakable things, secrets buried in time and rage that lingered like the scent of decay. And at the center of it all was Victoria, her vengeful spirit growing stronger with each passing day, feeding off the fear and suffering of those bound to the Dawson family. She had waited 25 long years, and now the curse she had woven in death was tightening its grip. Sarah was the first to feel it. She had always been a picture of health, her vibrant energy filling every room she entered. But after their wedding night, something inside her began to change. What had started as subtle fatigue soon spiraled into a sickness that no doctor could explain. Her skin grew pale, her eyes sunken, and dark circles shadowed her once bright features. But it wasn't just a physical ailment, it was something much darker, much deeper. The more Victoria's spirit haunted them, the weaker Sarah became, as if Victoria were draining her life force, slowly and methodically. Sarah knew, even before anyone else, that Victoria's curse was real. She could feel her presence in every shadow, in every cold breath of wind that swept through the house. At night, when the mansion was silent, Sarah would wake to the feeling of icy fingers brushing against her skin. The sensation so real that she would gasp and bolt upright, heart hammering, only to find the room empty. Yet the air would hang thick with a strange, oppressive cold, as if Victoria was standing right beside her, unseen but undeniably there. But it wasn't just Sarah who suffered. The entire family felt the weight of Victoria's wrath, though none more so than Mrs. Dawson, who had begun to sense the full extent of the curse. Every night the house seemed to come alive with sounds that didn't belong: footsteps in the attic, doors creaking open and slamming shut, voices whispering from the walls. The energy in the mansion shifted from eerie to dangerous, as if the house itself was conspiring against them, trapping them in a web of fear they couldn't escape. One night, as Sarah lay in bed trying in vain to find sleep, the temperature in the room plummeted without warning. Her breath came out in shallow, visible puffs, and her heart raced as the air thickened, pressing down on her chest like an invisible weight. Then, as she blinked against the dark, she saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her dress tattered and stained, her hair a wild, tangled mess, but it was the eyes that made Sarah's blood run cold hollow, dark pits that seemed to look through her, not at her. "You stole what was mine, ... The voice was a hasp, barely more than a whisper, but it filled the room, reverberating through Sarah's skull like a curse. The figure took a step closer, her movements slow, deliberate. I waited. For years ... The voice croaked. Sarah wanted to scream, but her body was frozen, her throat constricting as terror seized her. Victoria was no longer content to simply haunt the shadows. She was coming for Sarah, and each step she took toward the bed felt like a death sentence. Suddenly, Sarah's body convulsed, her back arching as if pulled by invisible strings. She felt hands cold, skeletal, gripping her wrists, pinning her to the bed. Her lungs burned as if the air around her had turned to ice. The pressure on her chest grew unbearable, squeezing the breath from her body. But just as quickly as it had begun, the presence vanished. Sarah collapsed onto the bed, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. She didn't need to look around the room to know the figure was gone, but her mind echoed Victoria's words, seared into her brain like a brand. Downstairs, Mrs. Dawson was growing frantic. She could hear the torment her daughter-in-law was enduring, even if she couldn't see. Every night, the house became more hostile, the walls groaning as if they were alive, the shadows shifting and twisting into grotesque shapes. Every window in the house rattled in its frame, and the cold seeped through the walls no matter how high the heat was turned up. The curse was tightening around them like a noose drawn taut, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. In her desperation, Mrs. Dawson had turned to anyone who would listen: priests, paranormal investigators, even psychics, but none had been able to lift the malevolent presence from their lives. Some had tried to contact Victoria's spirit directly to reason with her, but all had left the mansion shaken, their attempts futile against the force of her rage. It wasn't long before Michael began to experience her horrors firsthand. One evening, while sitting alone in the study, going over documents in an attempt to distract himself from the growing fear gnawing at the back of his mind, he felt it a chill in the air, sudden and unnatural. The fire in the hearth flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, reaching toward him like claws. Michael, the voice was soft, feminine, but unmistakably malevolent. He froze, his blood turning to ice as the temperature in the room dropped several degrees in an instant. Slowly, he turned toward the source of the voice, his heart pounding so hard in his chest it felt like it might burst. There, standing by the doorway, was the ghostly figure of a woman. Her long, dark hair hung limply over her face, and her pale skin seemed to glow in the dim light. Her eyes, two black, soulless pits, locked onto his. "You are to pay for your father's sins," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. Michael backed away, stumbling over the chair behind him. What do you want?" His voice cracked with fear, but the spirit remained still, her gaze never wavering. Everything the word came out like a hiss, and the figure lunged toward him, her hands reaching out, long, bony fingers grasping at his throat. Michael scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind him. He could feel the weight of her presence behind the door, pressing against it, but he didn't dare look back. His only thought was to find Sarah to make sure she was safe. But when he reached their bedroom, his blood turned cold. Sarah lay motionless on the bed, her skin pale as death, her breath shallow and weak. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, as if she were trapped in a waking nightmare. Days passed and the haunting only grew worse. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered, and the air in the mansion seemed to hum with a constant, oppressive energy. Sarah's health continued to deteriorate, her body growing weaker by the day. She was slipping away, just as Victoria had. One night, as Mrs. Dawson sat by Sarah's bedside, she heard a faint, eerie melody drifting through the house. It was the same song Victoria had played on the piano before her death, a haunting lullaby that echoed through the mansion's empty halls. As the music grew louder, Sarah's body convulsed violently, her eyes rolling back into her head as she gasped for breath. Mrs. Dawson screamed for Michael, but her voice was drowned out by the deafening melody that now filled the room. "She's here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Victoria, she's coming for Emmy." The lights flickered, and for a moment the room plunged into darkness. When the light returned, Victoria stood at the foot of the bed, her ghostly figure towering over Sarah. "It's time to finish what was started." Victoria's voice was like a snake's hiss, slithering through the air. Michael burst into the room just in time to see Victoria reach out, her hand inches from Sarah's throat. He lunged forward, grabbing a candlestick from the dresser and swinging it through the air. The candlestick passed through Victoria's form as if she were made of mist, but the force of his desperation was enough to send the ghost retreating, her figure fading into the shadows with a haunting laugh that echoed long after she was gone. For now, the attack was over, but the damage was done. Sarah lay unconscious, her body limp and cold, barely clinging to life. And Mrs. Dawson knew this was no longer just a haunting. It was a battle for Sarah's soul. The mansion had become a prison, a tomb where the family could no longer escape the wrath of the dead. Every moment they stayed, the more dangerous the situation became. Victoria's curse was unrelenting, her hunger for vengeance insatiable. And Sarah's time was running out. But there was one hope left, a dangerous, desperate plan that could either save Sarah or doom them all. Mrs. Dawson knew they had to confront Victoria's spirit to break the curse before it claimed another victim. But to do that, they would have to go deeper into the mansion, to the place where Victoria's body had been buried, and face the full wrath of her vengeful soul. With Sarah's life hanging by a thread, they had no choice. They would have to descend into the darkness, into the heart of the mansion's curse, and confront the spirit of Victoria Langley one final time. And as they prepared for the final confrontation, one thing was certain: Victoria was waiting. Part 7. The Blood-Red Letter. The house was quiet now, eerie still. The storm outside raged on, but inside the mansion, an oppressive silence pressed down on Mrs. Dawson and Michael. They had been waiting, anticipating the next haunting, the next cruel twist of Victoria's ghostly wrath. But this time, the air felt different, heavier, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something final to unfold. Michael sat hunched over in the parlor, eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling from sleepless nights. Sarah lay upstairs, barely clinging to life, her frail body barely moving. Each breath she took was shallow, her skin so pale it seemed translucent. The doctors had stopped coming. There was nothing they could do. Whatever illness she was suffering from, it wasn't something of this world, and that left only one option: confronting Victoria. Mrs. Dawson knew this, but the very thought sent shivers down her spine. The mansion had become a living entity, its walls pulsating with malice, its dark corridors echoing with the sinister whispers of the dead. She could feel it in her bones. The curse was near its breaking point. If they didn't act soon, it would devour Sarah completely. Suddenly, the phone rang. The shrill sound pierced the stillness, startling them both. It was the same phone, the ancient rotary one that had been ringing intermittently since this whole nightmare began. Mrs. Dawson's hand shook as she reached for it, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice on the other end was barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakably cold, dripping with venom. It was Victoria. Return. To where it all began, the line crackled, the static hissing in her ear as Mrs. Dawson clutched the phone tightly. Her throat was dry, her mouth unable to form words, but before she could respond, the voice continued, its words slow and deliberate. "You'll find the answer." In the room where the curse was born. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the call ended, leaving only the dead tone in its wake. Mrs. Dawson's hand hovered over the receiver, her mind racing. The room where the curse was born. She turned to Michael, her voice barely above a whisper. "She wants us back." At the mansion, Michael stood up, his face pale. "Back there? After everything that's happened?" There was no question in her mind. Whatever Victoria's intentions, they had no choice. If they wanted to save Sarah, they had to go back. The mansion greeted them like an old enemy. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature plummeted, their breaths turning into small puffs of visible air. The oppressive atmosphere returned, as though the house itself was watching them, waiting for their next move. Mrs. Dawson's heart raced as they navigated the long, winding hallways, each step echoing in the unnatural silence. The only sound was the creak of the wooden floor beneath their feet and the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof, like the house was bleeding from its own wounds. They arrived at the grand staircase, and Mrs. Dawson felt it, the unmistakable pull of something dark and ancient, guiding them deeper into the heart of the house. It led them to a room neither had dared enter before: the study, where Victoria had spent her final hours before death claimed her. The door creaked open on its own, as if the house was welcoming them in. Inside, the air was even colder, the darkness almost palpable. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light from the single window, its glass cracked and dirty. The room felt frozen in time, a mausoleum of forgotten memories. Old books lined the shelves, their spines cracked and worn, and a large oak desk dominated the center of the room. But it was what lay on the desk that made Mrs. Dawson's breath catch in her throat. A letter. The paper was old, yellowed with age, but the ink was fresh, glistening like wet blood. Mrs. Dawson hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the paper, a chill shot up her arm, and the words seemed to bleed into her mind. "Only the dead can break what the dead have cursed." The message was cryptic, yet chillingly clear. The curse that had plagued their family, the one slowly killing Sarah, could only be broken by the remains of Victoria Langley. They needed to find her body. Michael stared at the letter in disbelief. Her remains. After all this time, Mrs. Dawson nodded, her eyes scanning the room as if the walls themselves might give her the answer. We have to find her. It's the only way. As they stood in the study, the temperature dropped even further, and the walls seemed to close in on them. The once faint whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as if the house was trying to drown out their thoughts. Then, without warning, a loud bang echoed through the mansion. The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the study. The shadows in the room shifted, and for a moment it seemed like the house itself was coming alive, its very structure groaning under the weight of the curse. The air thickened with the stench of decay, and the cold became unbearable. Mrs. Dawson's hand tightened around the letter. We have to go. Now, as they made their way through the mansion, the house seemed to fight against them. The hallways twisted and stretched, the once familiar rooms now distorted and unfamiliar. Doors that had once been easy to open were now locked, and every step they took felt like they were moving deeper into some kind of otherworldly labyrinth. But Mrs. Dawson was determined. The letter had made it clear they needed to find Victoria's remains. The curse was tied to her death, and only by finding her body could they hope to save Sarah. It was a gruesome task, but there was no other choice. As they passed the ballroom, Michael froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Mrs. Dawson strained her ears, and sure enough, there was a faint sound, barely audible but unmistakable. It was a piano. The soft, haunting melody echoed through the empty mansion. The same song they had heard the night Sarah's health had begun to deteriorate. Mrs. Dawson whispered, her voice trembling. "She's trying to lead us." The music grew louder as they followed it down a narrow hallway, its mournful tune pulling them toward a forgotten part of the mansion. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, and as they approached, the music stopped abruptly, plunging the house back into silence. They pushed the door open, and there, in the center of the room, stood an old, rotting piano. The keys were yellowed with age, some missing altogether, but it was clear that this was the source of the music. The air in the room was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. But it wasn't the piano that held their attention. In the far corner of the room, behind a thick curtain of cobwebs, was a small door, barely noticeable in the dim light. "This must be," Michael said, his voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Dawson nodded, her heart racing. She could feel it. The answer was behind that door. They had come this far, and now they were so close to uncovering the truth. With trembling hands, they pulled the cobwebs aside and pushed the door open. A gust of cold, stale air rushed out, and they stepped into the darkness beyond. The room was small, more of a hidden alcove than a room, but it was what lay in the center that made their blood run cold. A coffin. It was old, its wood cracked and rotting, but the name etched into the lid was unmistakable. "Victoria Langley. This is it, Mrs." Dawson whispered, her voice barely audible. "We found her." The realization hit them like a wave of cold water. Victoria's body had been here all along, hidden away in this forgotten room, her spirit trapped in the mansion, seeking vengeance for the wrongs done to her. Michael knelt beside the coffin, his hands shaking. "What do we do now?" Mrs. Dawson glanced at the letter in her hand, the blood red ink still glistening in the dim light. The answer was clear. "We have to lay her to rest," she said, her voice firm. "We have to bury her properly. Give her peace." As they began the grim task of preparing to move the coffin, the air in the room shifted, and for the first time since entering the mansion, the oppressive weight lifted slightly. It was as if Victoria herself was watching, waiting to see if they would finally do what needed to be done. But deep down, Mrs. Dawson knew that this was far from over. Victoria's curse had run deep, and though they had found her remains, the true test was yet to come. And the house was still very much alive, waiting for the final act to unfold. Part 8. Unearthing Victoria's Remains. The night air was thick, oppressive, as if the mansion itself had come alive, feeding on their fear. Michael and Mrs. Dawson stood at the edge of the property, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. They knew what they had to do now. There was no turning back. Beneath the towering oak tree that stood like a sentry over the cursed grounds, Victoria Langley's remains lay hidden. The tree, with its gnarled roots and twisting branches, seemed almost like a guardian, keeping her trapped beneath the soil. But tonight, they would break that seal. They had to. For Sarah, for Michael's family, for any hope of escape from this nightmare. Michael's hands shook as he gripped the shovel. The blade hit the ground with a dull thud. the sound absorbed by the earth beneath him. Mrs. Dawson stood by, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of their task felt like an unbearable burden, but they had no choice. Victoria's spirit had left them no other option. They had found a cryptic letter in the study, the blood-red ink seared into their minds. Only the dead can break what the dead have cursed out, and so they had come to this, digging up the bones of a woman long dead, a woman who had been betrayed and abandoned, whose spirit now haunted them with a vengeance that knew no end. As the shovel dug deeper, the air around them grew colder. The still night seemed to tighten its grip, and the once gentle rustle of leaves turned into a harsh whisper, as if the mansion itself was urging them to stop. But they couldn't. Not now. Not when they were so close. "Keep going," Mrs. Dawson urged, her voice barely steady. She could feel it, the presence of something watching them, something malevolent. But they had come this far, and stopping now meant condemning Sarah to a fate worse than death. Michael's breathing was labored as he continued to dig, sweat mixing with the chill in the air. His muscles ached, and every strike of the shovel against the soil sent a shiver through him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to believe this was the way to break the curse. Suddenly, the shovel hit something hard. Both Michael and Mrs. Dawson froze. The sound echoed in the otherwise silent night, louder than it had any right to be. Michael knelt down, his trembling hands brushing the dirt away. His fingers scraped against something cold and unyielding wood. The old rotting wood of a coffin. Here he whispered, more to himself than to Mrs. Dawson. "This is it." With great care, they cleared away the remaining dirt, revealing the ancient coffin beneath the tree. It was decayed, the wood barely holding together after so many years. The name etched into the lid, though faint, was unmistakable: Victoria Langley. Mrs. Dawson's breath caught in her throat. They had found her. As they stood there staring at the coffin, a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees. The temperature dropped even further, and a sense of dread washed over them. It was as if the earth itself was warning them, telling them they were about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Michael hesitated. "Should we open it?" Mrs. Dawson swallowed hard. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, to leave this cursed place behind. But there was no escaping the reality of what had to be done. "Yes," she whispered, "we have to." With shaking hands, Michael pried the lid open. The wood groaned in protest, but eventually gave way, revealing the skeletal remains of Victoria Langley. The bones were old, fragile, but there was no mistaking who they belonged to. The air around them seemed to thicken, the shadows deepening, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Suddenly the wind died down, and everything went deathly silent. Then a voice. "You shouldn't have come here," both Michael and Mrs. Dawson spun around, their eyes wide with fear. Standing just a few feet away, bathed in the airy light of the moon, was Victoria Langley. Her ghostly form was as beautiful as it was terrifying. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, her eyes cold and filled with rage. Her dress, once elegant and flowing, now looked like it had been woven from the shadows themselves, trailing behind her as she hovered above the ground. "You think you can undo what's been done?" Victoria's voice was icy, dripping with contempt. "You think you can stop this curse?" Mrs. Dawson took a step forward, trying to steady her voice. "We found your remains. We can give you peace, Victoria. We can bury you properly, peace." Victoria laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that sent chills down their spines. "There is no peace for me. Not after what your family did to me." Michael stood frozen, his mouth dry. "Victoria, please. We didn't know. We just want to end this." Victoria's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time there was something almost human in her gaze. Sadness. Pain. Betrayal. "You can't end this." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "This curse was born of betrayal, of a love lost, and it can only end in blood." Mrs. Dawson's heart raced. "But we found your body. There must be a way." Victoria's gaze snapped to Mrs. Dawson, her eyes blazing with fury. "The curse isn't about my body. It's about the soul that was ripped apart when I was abandoned, left to die alone in the dark." The wind picked up again, swirling around them, and Michael felt his knees buckle as Victoria's presence grew stronger, more oppressive. He could feel her rage, her sorrow, all of it crashing down on him like a wave. "Michael cannot be saved," Victoria declared, her voice final. "The curse must be completed. It's too late to stop it now." Michael's heart sank, a cold knot forming in his chest. "What do you mean? What curse?" Victoria's eyes darkened, and she floated closer, her form growing more imposing with every step. Your father's betrayal set this in motion. His selfishness, his cruelty. He created the bond that tied us together. And now, you must pay for his sins." "No," Mrs. Dawson shouted, stepping in front of Michael. "There has to be another way. There has to be—" But Victoria's expression was unyielding. "The only way to break the curse is through sacrifice." Michael's voice was barely a whisper. What kind of sacrifice?" Victoria smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was cold, calculating. "A life for life. Just as I was taken, someone must be given. That is the only way." Michael stared at her, his mind reeling. You want me to die?" Victoria's gaze softened for just a moment. "I want justice. I want what was stolen from me. And you, Michael, you are the key." Mrs. Dawson butt round cold. "There has to be another way. There has to," but Victoria shook her head, her ghostly form flickering as the wind howled around them. "There is no other way. The curse demands it. And it will be fulfilled whether you want it or not." The wind picked up, swirling faster and faster around them, and Victoria's form began to fade into the darkness. Her voice echoed in the night air, cold and relentless. "The curse will be completed. Michael cannot escape his fate," thought, and with that, she was gone. The night fell silent once more, but the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Michael and Mrs. Dawson stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The curse wasn't over, not yet, and Michael's fate was sealed. There was no escaping it now. Part 9. The curse fulfilled. The air hung thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere had absorbed the despair that now filled the mansion. The night was eerie still, with even the wind seeming to hold its breath, waiting for what was about to unfold. Every step Michael took felt like it echoed through the hollow halls of the cursed estate, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't give in to the dread that gnawed at his insides. "Please, Victoria, Mrs." Dawson's voice trembled as she stood beside her son, her eyes scanning the dark shadows that seemed to creep closer with each passing second. "You don't have to do this. We're sorry for what happened to you. There has to be another way." But her words fell into the silence, met only by the oppressive weight of the unseen presence lurking just beyond their sight. Victoria Langley's spirit was here, but she wasn't ready to show herself. Not yet. The mansion had become her domain, her hunting ground, and now the final act was about to be written. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. His breathing was shallow, each inhaler laced with the sickening realization that there was no escaping the fate laid out before him. His body felt heavy, as though the curse itself had wrapped its icy fingers around his soul, tightening its grip with every step closer to the inevitable end. She heard Sarah's weak voice echoed from behind them. She was barely standing, her skin pale and clammy, her eyes distant. She could feel Victoria's presence more strongly than anyone, as if the curse had tied their fates together. Every breath Sarah took seemed to draw Victoria's spirit closer, binding them to her ghostly vengeance. Michael turned to face her, his eyes filled with the agony of helplessness. He reached out, his hand shaking as it touched hers, cold and lifeless. "Sarah will find a way, we'll stop this." But deep down, even he knew those words were hollow. Suddenly the temperature in the room dropped sharply, the icy chill of death settling in. The windows rattled in their frames, as if the mansion itself was bracing for the final blow. Michael looked around, his eyes wide, desperate. Mrs. Dawson's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob as the lights flickered and the shadows danced with malevolent glee. Then, without warning, Victoria appeared. She emerged from the shadows like a wraith, her form half submerged in darkness, her eyes burning with a cold fury that had only grown stronger over the years. Her translucent figure floated above the ground, her long dress billowing like smoke around her, and her face, once beautiful, now twisted with vengeful rage, was locked onto Michael. "It's time," Victoria said, her voice cold and final. The words cut through the silence like a dagger, chilling them to the bone. "The debt must be paid, Victoria. Please." Michael dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. We're all so sorry. My father, he was a cruel man. But please, let us go. Let Sarah go." Victoria's gaze flickered to Sarah, who was barely able to stand. Her expression softened for a fleeting second, and there was a glimpse, just a flicker, of the woman she once was, the woman who had known love, pain, and betrayal. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold, unyielding resolve. "There is no forgiveness for betrayal," Victoria hissed, her voice carrying the weight of decades of torment. No escape from the curse. The wrongs of the past must be paid for with blood. Sarah gasped, her knees buckling as she fell to the floor, clutching her chest. Her breathing became ragged, and her face contorted in agony. The curse was closing in on her too, wrapping its tendrils around her life force, squeezing it out of her with every second that passed. Sarah, Michael cried, rushing to her side. But before he could reach her, he collapsed to the floor, his body writhing in pain. The curse had taken hold of him now, dragging him down into the same abyss that had claimed so many before him. Victoria floated closer, her face inches from Michael's, her cold breath brushing against his skin. Your father left me to die, abandoned me when I needed him most. And now you will suffer the same fate. You will die alone, just as I did. No, Mrs. Dawson screamed, rushing forward, but Victoria's eyes snapped to her, stopping her in her tracks. The air around them grew thick with a suffocating darkness, and Mrs. Dawson felt as though her very soul was being crushed beneath the weight of Victoria's presence. Stay back, Victoria warned, her voice echoing with an otherworldly power. This is not your fate to share, but you will live with the knowledge that you could not save him. The room began to shake violently, the walls groaning under the strain of the supernatural forces that had been unleashed. The chandeliers swung wildly above them, their lights flickering ominously as the temperature plummeted further. Michael's body went limp, his eyes rolling back into his head as his breath came in shallow, desperate gasps. He could feel his life slipping away, the curse pulling him deeper into the void. No, Sarah screamed, her voice filled with anguish. She reached out to him, but her strength was failing, her vision blurring as the darkness consumed her as well. Victoria hovered over them, her eyes cold and unfeeling. This was justice. This was the price that had to be paid. With one final breath, Michael's body jerked violently, and then he was still. A deafening silence fell over the room. Mrs. Dawson's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her sobs echoing through the now dead mansion. Michael was gone. Her son, her last hope, had been taken by the curse, and there was nothing she could do. Victoria's gaze shifted to Sarah, who lay on the floor, barely alive. She knelt down beside her, her ghostly fingers brushing against Sarah's cold cheek. Your suffering is not over, Victoria whispered, her voice laced with dark promise. You will live with the knowledge of his death, and every breath you take will remind you of the curse that claimed him. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, filled with tears. She was too weak to speak, too broken to fight back. All she could do was watch as Victoria's ghostly form began to fade, disappearing into the shadows once more. But the mansion would never be free of her. Her presence would linger here, haunting these halls for all eternity. The curse had been fulfilled, but the pain, the suffering, and the fear it would never truly end. As Victoria vanished, the mansion grew still once again. The only sound was the soft sobbing of Mrs. Dawson and the hollow echo of Sarah's broken breathing. Outside, the wind began to howl once more, carrying with it the whispers of the dead. The curse was complete, but the haunting was far from over, for in the dark corners of the mansion, Victoria Langley would always be waiting, always watching, and the souls of those who crossed her path would never escape her grasp. The mansion, once grand and beautiful, now stood as a monument to the curse, a place where time itself seemed to stop, where the past and present merged into one terrifying nightmare. It would forever be a place of fear, where the dead walked alongside the living, and where Victoria's vengeance would reign eternal. Sarah, broken and alone, would live out the rest of her days in the shadow of that curse, haunted by the memory of Michael's death, knowing that she had survived but at what cost. And as the night stretched on, the cold wind carried Victoria's final words through the mansion's decaying walls. Justice has been served, and the curse will never die, though the mansion would never be silent again.